There was this moment in 2012 when the U.S. and Iran almost stumbled into a war. The tension had been ratcheting up for months, and the U.S. had tried everything: diplomacy, sanctions, sabotage, and outright threats. Meanwhile, Israel was sitting on a knife's edge, drawing literal red lines that drove home predictions that the country might launch an attack any day.
Could Israel launch an attack on Iran before the U.S. election in November? As the drums of war beat louder in Israel.
But Iran still seemed to be marching toward a bomb.
Shows that there is more installation of centrifuges in this Fordo plant.
Then, like something straight out of the movies, the Obama administration gets this offer from a mysterious fixer for the Sultan of Oman, a tiny little country in the Gulf. The Sultan's fresh off his successful negotiation to free a group of American hikers held in Iran. And he wants to set up a secret meeting. Like 007 secret. This would be a last-ditch diplomatic effort to avert a military strike on Iran. So, who do you call when you need your very own Bond?
My name is Jake Sullivan. I served in the Obama administration at both the State Department and the White House.
Then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton calls her aide Jake.
I land in Muscat, and I am met at the bottom of the stairs of the plane by an Omani in traditional Omani dress with the headscarf and the robes, who puts me in a car. Okay, sorry, no.
Okay, so maybe he's not quite Bond.
I'm not a good poker player. I turn red very easily. I have the Irish Catholic guilt thing. So I'm not all that well designed for this kind of subterfuge.
Maybe more like Peter Parker.
All right, hold on. All right, I'm going to start over again.
Before he became Spider-Man.
I arrive in Muscat in the middle of the night, having just flown in coach class, carrying my bag, trying to sleep along the way, but being a little too excited to sleep.
The meeting in Oman is so secret, Jake lets his colleagues believe he has to slip away for a family emergency.
I get there probably around midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, and I drive to an empty house that is the residence of a senior diplomat in the U.S. Embassy in Muscat, in Oman.
Once he arrives, Jake meets with another colleague, Puneet Talwar. And this is where you get a real sense of the glamorous life of a top administration official.
Puneet takes one of the kids' bedrooms and sleeps on a kid's bed, and Puneet's over 6 feet tall, so his feet...
Tiny twin bed.
His feet are coming off the edge of the bed, and I take the couch and sleep on the couch.
And you are not of short stature either.
No, so I guess the technical term is I curl up on the couch.
Right.
And we try to get a few hours sleep before the series of meetings that we're meant to have the next day. It was very much a question mark as to whether this was real.
Today on Things That Go Boom, we'll dig into how, exactly, diplomacy gets done, how the Iran deal got done, and not the Hollywood movie version because, well, diplomacy just isn't as sexy as Bond.
Well, we all thought we were living Groundhog Day. I mean, we really felt stir-crazy.
This is the real-life version, where imperfect, sleep-deprived people pore over thousands of pages of technical documents, sleep on couches and floors, and lose their cool more than once.
You know, if you can't do this deal, go home and get more instructions or just tell me it can't happen.
There are huge political stakes, stalemates, and even a few broken bones.
Experiencing the news each day can feel like a journey. With Up First from NPR, it doesn't have to be. Welcome to 15 easy minutes of breaking news, clarity on international and national affairs, all handed over not from some floating voice in the sky, from us, Layla, A, Steve, and me, Rachel. Start your day informed. Subscribe to Up First wherever you get your podcasts.
When Jake wakes up the next morning, he's not 100% sure the Iranians will even show up. They've been playing a back-and-forth game of telephone for months. The White House talking to the Omanis, then the Omanis to the Iranians who go back home, talk it over, and call up the Omanis who get back to the White House. It's a logistical nightmare. And Jake is not a logistical nightmare kind of guy. He's a nice kid from Minnesota, but also a former debate champ who might even have become the youngest national security advisor in the history of the White House if Hillary had won in 2016. He sweats the details. So When the day of the meeting with the Iranians finally comes, he's on edge.
It's this kind of almost staged, managed entry, the big reveal where we both walk in through these doors and they instinctively put their hands on their chests to send the signal to us. Essentially, we don't want to be rude, but we're also not here to shake your hands. So we got the message.
It's an awkward introduction, and the truth is, Jake still doesn't know exactly who these guys are.
You have the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, you have the clerics, you have the judiciary, you have the president.
So they start to talk, slowly, because...
Statement, interpretation.
Interpreters.
Statement, interpretation. It made it feel like we were not driving the Indy 500 at top speed. We were taking a nice lap around the track.
And eventually, Jake starts to breathe a sigh of relief.
It becomes clear fairly early on in this first session that these are serious professionals. They spoke as definitively as we did about the authority and the blessing that they had.
But it doesn't take long before that pit of anxiety in his stomach, it starts to come back.
They have expectations about what they're going to get from the United States, and they have expectations that they're not going to have to give up very much to get it.
This meeting isn't going to go the way he wants it to go.
It's a success in the sense that we now have a channel that can work, but we don't yet have a partner in that channel who is ready to go the distance.
Jake starts to realize how long this is going to take, if it's going to happen at all. And he also realizes he's going to have to break the news to Secretary Clinton.
Well, the fact is, I am very tired and frankly very stressed. I feel like I didn't crack the code with the Iranians.
You didn't save the world in one meeting?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm thinking to myself, did we screw this up somehow? Did we say something wrong? Could we have made progress if we had taken a different tack?
To get back to Clinton's team, Jake has to ping-pong from Muscat to Dubai, Dubai to Beijing, and Beijing to his final destination, where he gets in an SUV. He's bumping over country roads for hours.
And by the way, I'm a little bit of an unreliable narrator on this because I'm in something of a fog as this goes on. But I see a kind of large circular structure, tented structure, and I walk in and everyone is in the middle of a Mongolian feast.
In a giant yurt. Clinton and her team are in Mongolia on part of a tour dedicated to the Obama administration's so-called pivot to Asia. And remember how Jake let his colleagues believe he had a family emergency?
They're worried about me. And so they all come up and say, "Are you okay?" And of course I'm like, well, no, not entirely. I'm really stressed and tired. But
there you go.
But I can't share with them what's happening.
And then there's Clinton. He needs to tell her what happened with the Iranians, but he can't.
From here on, everything is Class A security.
Wait a minute, Chief. Didn't you just say Class A security?
I did.
Needless to say, your typical yurt isn't exactly a secure place for top-secret communications.
Well, then shouldn't we... Do you want me to leave the room?
They don't have a shoe phone.
We can talk under the cone of silence.
And I catch Secretary Clinton's eye, and I speak in sort of coded, guarded language just to give her the very top line, because she's heard nothing at this point.
Clinton decides to press on. They know the chances are slim, but it's worth it. The stakes are high. Iran's nuclear program is getting scarier by the day.
If Iran actually got a nuclear weapon, that would set off an arms race across the Middle East and potentially across the world, because the Saudis and the Turks and the Egyptians and others would all feel like they should get nuclear weapons.
And hey, maybe that doesn't sound so bad. There are actually some experts who argue that the more weapons we all have, the less we'll want to lob them at each other. But then you remember, it just takes one.
Whether you live in Los Angeles or you live in my hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota, or you live in West Palm Beach, Florida, having multiple countries in the most volatile, dangerous region in the world with their hands on nuclear weapons is something that puts America's security at risk. And not just because you could have a nuclear war among those countries, but because it's that much more likely that nuclear weapons would fall into the hands of terrorists.
Behind the scenes, the U.S. and Israel are fighting a covert war against Iran's nuclear program. But Iran is still too close for comfort. And Israel's prime minister thinks he might have to intervene. If Israel bombs Iran, it could pull the U.S. into a war.
Where should a red line be drawn? A red line should be drawn right here, before Iran completes the second stage of nuclear enrichment.
At the same time, new rounds of European and American sanctions are putting the squeeze on Iran's economy. In October of 2012, its currency plunges 40%. Iran's people are feeling the pain.
High inflation, which means the cost of staples like food have soared.
Sanctions are not directed at Iran's healthcare system, but Iranians say they have made it harder to import medicine and vital equipment.
They're calling for change.
Blaming government mismanagement rather than the sanctions.
And Iran's leaders, they're starting to feel like they're in the crosshairs. In the middle of all this mess, Jake keeps talking to the Iranians.
So we sneak into and out of hotel rooms in New York.
Sometimes with unexpected company.
Including one meeting in the Waldorf Astoria where a picture of the Shah is actually on the wall in the hallway leading to the room that we are meeting in. And so
that's kind of amazing.
We get nervous about whether this might not be the best ambiance
Did
for a
that
meeting.
turn out to be awkward?
We don't speak of it. They don't speak of it. We move on. But it's just one of those kind of human things that unfolds as part of this process.
But they all know that the negotiations could unravel anytime.
And I'm displaying my frustration a bit. And we reach the end of a session, and one of the Iranian negotiators comes up to me and says, Mr. Sullivan, when you get off the plane in New York City at John F. Kennedy Airport, there's a giant sign that greets you there that says, "Welcome to America, think the big." And that is what we must do, Mr. Sullivan, in these negotiations. We must think the big. And so I kind of looked at him and thought, okay, yeah, let's think the big.
So they do. Jake and his colleagues are reporting to Wendy Sherman, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs.
I joke about motherhood that if you've had a 2-year-old or a teenager, you've become a good negotiator.
I'd be selling Wendy short if I described her as anything less than a force. She once briefed Congress just minutes after breaking her pinky finger, with the finger still sticking out at a right angle. She says it was probably the most focused briefing of her life. Wendy describes the negotiations as a Rubik's Cube.
Because there were all these interlocking pieces. How many centrifuges? What level of enrichment? What facilities would be closed down? What kinds of inspections would be required? How would we verify this?
And in September of 2013, one of those pieces falls into place, just after Iran elects a new president, a moderate named Hassan Rouhani.
Just now, I spoke on the phone with President Rouhani of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
It was just a 15-minute phone call, but one that was 34 years in the making.
The very fact that this was the first communications between an American and Iranian president since 1979 underscores the deep mistrust between our countries, but it also indicates the prospect of moving beyond that difficult history.
By Thanksgiving, the team has an interim deal, which puts a short-term freeze on Iran's nuclear program and buys everyone a little time. But now, Jake's secret negotiations are out there for all the world to see, and the clock is ticking. By this time, President Obama's won his second term, so he has some room to take the risk. But he has to keep the momentum, so he decides to put all his chips on the table. Iran, he decides, will be his signature foreign policy achievement. The U.S. negotiating team like to joke about the movie version of what comes next.
I would be played by Meryl Streep from The Devil Wears Prada because she had silver hair like I do.
Wendy's a dead ringer for Streep's character.
My team quickly assured me it wasn't because I was as horrible as she was.
They also decided Ted Danson would play John Kerry. And Jake, he'd be played by Macaulay Culkin. We're guessing at this point they probably needed to have a little fun. Iran's nuclear program was so close to a weapon, failing to get the deal could be dire. And one reason why is this complicated little detail that we're going to go ahead and have Ernie Moniz explain. He's a nuclear physicist, and he was Secretary of Energy at the time the deal was negotiated. And just in case you're wondering, he was also a character in the movie version of the deal.
Well, they decided that you were Javier Bardem.
Previously, that connection has been made.
Moniz's hair is long, wavy. It definitely resembles Bardem's in one very specific movie.
Especially when he was the murderer in, was it No,
it was No Country
for Old Men?
Yeah.
I think I'm watching too many shows.
How do you feel about that comparison?
It's fine as long as it's focusing on him as a mass murderer.
So here it is. Uranium contains two principal isotopes. The important one is called U-235. The uranium you find in nature is made up of less than 1% of U-235. So if you want to build a nuclear power plant, you'll need 4 or 5%. How do you get there?
Okay, think about a big tub of jelly beans.
Let's say those rare isotopes, the U-235, they're something good. Something like watermelon. Those are green, right? All the other jelly beans are white, with flecks of yellow. Those popcorn-flavored jelly beans are the worst. And your job is to start picking out the white jelly beans and tossing them aside. You do this for a while, and now your tub still has mostly white jelly beans in it, but it has a higher concentration of those special green ones, the tasty watermelon. This is basically what a centrifuge does. Then, you pour your jelly beans into a new tub and you start all over again. Only now,
you will have gone through a lot of work, a lot of jelly beans, right? So when you want to go to the next step is far fewer that you got to kind of keep tossing out.
So the sorting process is speeding up.
Actually see them all there, and the work is even less.
Now let's say you want to go a step further. You want to make radioisotopes for cancer treatment. So now you need uranium enriched to 20%. This is where nuclear experts draw a line in the jelly beans. It's a bit arbitrary as a marker, but remember, the more enriched your uranium is, the smaller your tub of jelly beans, and the less work you have to do to enrich the rest of the way.
A lot of times, people snuggle up to the 20% line as close as they can.
Iran had snuggled right up to 20%.
And if you want to go to a nuclear weapon, then typically you would go to above 90%. And that's one of the reasons of the great concern is that it doesn't take much more to put that material through the centrifuges and get to bomb material.
Iran had roughly 19,000 centrifuges. Moniz did the math.
If you made the assumption that Iran wanted to use those centrifuges all out to make the 90% material for a nuclear weapon, they would be able to do that, let's say, in 2 to 3 months.
2 to 3 months.
And as they accumulated more and more material, then that time frame would get even shorter.
So the clock was ticking, and it was ticking fast, and Iran was adding capabilities month by month, year by year. And that meant that the window for diplomacy was closing, and the possibility of military force, of war, was rising.
By the summer of 2015, Iran nuclear talks are in full swing. But it's an uphill slog. So Secretary of State John Kerry takes to his bike to blow off some steam.
Get great exercise. It's environmentally friendly. It's great for stress relief, and I find that I can think through problems, write a speech.
You might not know this, but he's really into cycling. He's been known to show up at the Tour de France and spout Nelson Mandela, quotes like this one, to his favorite riders.
It always seems impossible until it is done.
The Tour is a grueling race. It's like running a marathon a day uphill for almost a month. And at this point, it seems like a pretty good metaphor for the Iran talks. So Kerry gets on his bike and heads for a big climb in the French Alps to clear his mind.
Where Secretary of State John Kerry has been hospitalized after a biking accident in France. The State Department just announced that he's calling off his diplomatic mission.
That information, the Secretary of State has in fact broken his leg. It's a fracture to the right femur. He's now traveling directly back to Boston for treatment.
Diplomacy isn't exactly thought of as a high-impact sport. So the sheer number of broken bones associated with this particular deal is a little surprising. But even more telling than the injuries themselves might be the team's reaction to them. When Kerry breaks his leg on his bike in the middle of negotiations, he pretty much toughs it out.
And so he did his last 2.5 weeks in Vienna on crutches and in some pain with very little pain medication because he wanted to be mentally acute.
Wendy also has another mishap. It's not quite as bad as that finger, but it's close.
I was rushing up to a secure phone, and I ran into a glass door. I bled quite a bit. My team said, "Oh, time for the ambulance." I said, No, you're clearly not mothers. Get me some ice. I went to a great ear, nose, and throat doctor in Vienna the next day who took care of all the opera singers. And although it was broken in several places, you don't do much for broken noses these days unless they're really askew. And makeup helped a great deal.
Sort of like the opera singers, as it turns out. The show goes on. And it takes almost 2 grueling years. But finally,
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry arrives in Vienna to meet with his Iranian and EU counterparts in a push to reach a final agreement on Iran.
The team finds itself at the finish line. And it's beautiful in more ways than one.
So the Palais Coburg is sort of like a white wedding cake in terms of the way it looks. The hotel had been a favorite, quite frankly, of Russian oligarchs, so it was rather overdone.
John Kerry and the negotiators remain walled off behind the Baroque facade of a former palace, where gunpowder was stored underground to defend Vienna from the Ottomans.
And there was an important balcony so that those, particularly my Russian and Chinese colleagues who needed a smoke, could go out on the balcony and get their smoke.
The city of Mozart, Strauss, and chocolate, compensating a little for all those missed special occasions back home.
Folks pack in for a few days with the sense that a deal is right around the bend. They work day and night, hammering out the final details. And soon, that beautiful place starts to feel less like a palace and more like a prison.
We are not yet where we need to be on several of the most difficult issues.
One morning, I think it was a Saturday morning, I came down to the lobby and all of the Iranians were dressed casually and they had gathered there in the lobby, and I asked them where they were going, and they said that they had rented a bus to go on the Sound of Music tour in Salzburg.
As in Julie Andrews, belting it out, running from Nazis.
And so I was asking them, what is that? And they very enthusiastically described to me the way this works is the bus plays the songs and they drive around to all of the sites from the movie, like the gazebo and, the meadow.
The hills are alive.
And they were all loading up to go do this because The Sound of Music apparently was a smash hit in Iran. And it's like, this is the kind of thing where you have to remember these guys are representatives of a repressive, aggressive regime. They are kind of constantly lying to us about the nature of their programs, but they're also guys going out on a Saturday morning on the Sound of Music tour. And that cognitive dissonance really, I think, is part of diplomacy. And there's a very human aspect to all of this that I think is just really important for us to take into account. This stuff doesn't happen like cooked up in a laboratory. It's carried out among human beings across the table with all the imperfections that they bring.
But if there's one thing diplomacy isn't, it's fast. A week goes by, then 2 weeks.
I was there for 27 straight days, ate exactly one meal outside the hotel.
Negotiators are washing their underwear in the sink, and reporters are sleeping on the floor of the press tent. They blow right past the deadline for negotiations, and the U.S. threatens to walk.
The high-stakes game of deal or no deal continues in Vienna.
At this point, this negotiation could go either way.
There are gaps they can't get across, especially when it comes to how many centrifuges Iran can keep and what to do with a heavy water facility that could produce plutonium, which could be a second path to a nuclear bomb. The tension builds for almost a month, until finally,
progress has been reported in 2 key areas: the pace of sanctions relief and a probe into whether Tehran's nuclear activity...
They're so close they can taste the flight home. Wendy has one final meeting she hopes will seal the deal.
Day 25, we were working on what was really the last big substantive piece, and that was the UN Security Council resolution. And it had been a very difficult negotiation.
They need to agree on the terms of a new resolution that covers non-nuclear issues, like ballistic missiles and arms transfers. So Wendy and Rob Malley, her deputy, sit down with their Iranian counterparts, Abbas Arachi and Majid Takhtaravanchi.
We were all exhausted. None of us had slept much. So we were all wiped out. And I'd put a scrap of paper on the table with some formulas I thought could work.
She slowly slides the piece of paper across the table. Diplomats really do that.
And so Abbas leaned forward and he said, okay, I think this one can work. And I thought, this is great. We're going to get this done.
They were ready to get the hell out of Vienna.
And then Abbas took a breath and he said, in true style, but one more thing. And I just lost it. I completely lost it. I got really angry and I said, what are you doing? You are putting the entire deal at risk. Somewhere along the line, I think like many women, I learned getting angry is not something I'm supposed to do, but it is okay to cry. So when I get angry or highly emotional, I tend to cry, and I've tried to dig my nails into my hand to stop myself over the years. Doesn't work. So there I was yelling at them, which they hadn't seen me do before quite like this, and sobbing. Rob had no idea what to do with me either, and Abbas and Majid just sort of stared dumbfounded. Everybody was sort of quiet.
I feel this hard.
I wouldn't suggest anybody use tears as a technique.
But Wendy's tears are this genuinely real moment. She's just human.
We are our most powerful when we are our authentic selves. Everybody is their strongest and most powerful when they use all the talents and all the experience of who they are. And then Abbas said, okay, we're done.
Diplomacy is almost always the longer path, the harder path. It can drive you to tears, and in the end, it can still fall short.
Well, first of all, there's no such thing as a diplomatic deal that's perfect, because if one side gets everything at once and the other side gets nothing at once and gives up everything, that's not called diplomacy, that's called surrender.
But diplomacy can also stop a war.
What's interesting is sitting here today in 2019, we don't think of Iran as being on the brink, of being inches from the goal line of getting a nuclear weapon. But that's where they were in 2012 and 2013 before we put a lid on their program.
Next time on Things That Go Boom, we'll ask why Iran wanted a nuclear weapon anyway. Spoiler alert, we might have had something to do with it. Things That Go Boom is a production of PRX and Inkstick Media. For more information and behind-the-scenes action, follow us on social at Inkstick Media or visit inkstickmedia.com. Our show is produced by Ruth Morris. Catherine Fink is our assistant producer, and Mary Beth Kirshner is our story whisperer. Darian Schulman composes our music, and our engineer is Robin Wise. A huge thank you to John Barth, Melinda Ward, Kelsey Davenport, and Hannah Kaviani for their background and review. Wendy Sherman's book, by the way, is called Not for the Faint of Heart. Finally, thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Plowshares Fund, and N Square for making our show possible.
Last thing I want to ask you about, where were you when you heard that Trump was pulling out of the deal? Do you remember where you were?
Yes, I do. I was in Boston, actually, and that night I drank alone in a bar, which now that I'm saying that, yeah, I think I drank alone in a bar and didn't drink too much, but yes, it was the tableau of the sad man at the bar drinking. Thank you for dredging that memory back up. I appreciate it.